Okay, so maybe we can go ahead and get started and let people come in as we are proceeding. Does that sound okay to you, Professor Hoffnung?
It is. Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Thank you. So let me, I have an introduction of Professor Hoffnung. I'd like to thank the Center for Jewish Studies for sponsoring this talk, and Professor Menachem Hoffnung of the Department of Political Science, Hebrew University in Jerusalem, for his time in giving us this talk at a very timely topic. Menachem Hoffnung is Professor of Political Science in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He has been a chair of the Department of Political Science at Hebrew University. He was a president of the Israel Law and Society Association, a professional academic association, chair of the International Political Science Association Research Committee on Political Finance in Israel. He has been a president of the Association for Israel Studies, an academic professional organization in the United States. Professor Hoffnung has served as academic director of the Joint Graduate Program in Public Policy and Law at the Hebrew University. He has been academic director of the Gilo Center for Democracy and Civic Education, and chair of the board of directors of B'Tselem, the Israeli Center for Human Rights in the occupied territories. Menachem Hoffnung has served as a member of the National Commission on Campaign Finance Reform, the Levin Commission of 2000, and was a member of the National Commission on the Structure of Governmental Administration in Israel, the Magidor Commission, in 2006. Professor Hoffnung's research covers national security, civil liberties, constitutional politics, and comparative political finance. Menachem Hoffnung is one of the editors of the Oxford Handbook of Israeli Politics and Society and has a number of important books to his credit. Professor Hoffnung has served in the Israeli Defense Forces as a combat officer and retired from reserve duty at the rank of major. He has also taught at the University of California, Berkeley, and at the University of California, Irvine, San Francisco State, and at the University of Florida in Gainesville. He was a visitor here some years ago, I think it was 2002 and 2003, in our Department of Political Science. He has taught at Moscow State University and was a research fellow at the Center for Law and Society at the University of California, Berkeley, and Sydney University, Australia. He was also very kindly my sponsor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem Department of Political Science for my last year of dissertation research many years ago. And I actually met him for the first time in 1998 when he was in Seattle to give a talk at the University of Washington, Jackson School of International Studies and Department of Political Science. So I was his graduate student chaperone, which meant that I picked him up at the airport and got him from place to place for a good part of his visit. So that was about 25 years ago now, almost, and he is gracious as ever in giving us his time, so it is with pleasure that I introduce him to you. The center has asked us to conduct the talk by way of conversation, so I will ask a few questions and we can proceed that way, and then we will make time for questions at the end. Professor Hoffnung, did you have any comments, anything you wanted to say before I start asking questions?
First, I'd like to thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. So in less than a month, Israel is going to the polls for the 4th time in 2 years. Is this a constitutional or a political crisis that causes frequent elections?
Right now, it looks as a political crisis, but it may develop into a constitutional crisis if there is no clear decision in the following following elections. The 4 consecutive elections were needed because about half of the electorate was unwilling to join a coalition headed by Netanyahu, by current Prime Minister Netanyahu. On the other hand, they could not gather enough votes to form an alternative coalition. So in that case, if Netanyahu is removed, then there is no problem whatsoever to form a new coalition. But in case the elections are undecided, as the previous 4, then it may develop into a constitutional crisis because there is all kind of possible scenarios that can develop there. And also, if Netanyahu wins and the prime minister himself is standing a trial or tries to evade the trial, then the political crisis can turn into a constitutional one.
Thank you. So it seems as if the Israeli Supreme Court is a non-active player in that electoral campaign. Why do we have parties running against the court?
This is something that's going on since the mid-90s. At that time, after the Israeli Knesset has enacted 3 new basic laws in 1992, the court had gotten new powers of judicial review, and it was able to interfere much more in everyday decisions of the government. Unfortunately, several of the new decisions, the constitutional decisions of the court, were involving religious institutions. And the ultra-Orthodox parties and the religious parties altogether in the 1996 campaign found that it pays to run against the court. I can later go into what kind of decision the court had made. And it paid off. They all gained many more seats, all of them. So since then, they found that it pays to run against the court, whether they are in opposition or in coalition. I do have to add that many of the cases that brought against religious institutions, the Supreme Court found that petitions do have a merit on various grounds. And therefore, I can see why they felt that the court is discriminating against them. But it goes on for 25 years. They're trying to change the entire system. And it may continue as long as the power structure seems that it is right now.
Is there a grain, excuse me, is there a grain of truth to the claims that the court is too strong and that it often prevents the ruling government from implementing its policies?
My personal opinion is that the court is not too strong. I do have to admit that there are academics who think the court is too strong, but it seems to me that most of the court interventions in the working of government are in cases that the ministers or the prime minister are really stepping out of their authority. And I can give you an example of the last month. The Minister of Internal Affairs, who is also in charge of the Israeli prison, decided not to allow prisoners to get the COVID-19 vaccine. A petition was submitted to the court, and the court asked the minister and the prime minister to give an answer or to answer the petitions. They didn't answer the petition. And at the end, the court decided in favor of the petitioners, but not only because the minister did not answer, but also because the minister did not have an authority. The only minister who can prevent any group of people from being vaccinated is a minister of health. This is the law. So in that case, depends how you present the case to the public. If it is presented as a minister acting out of his authority, it is one thing. But if you can say I didn't want the prisoners to get the vaccine, and the court has prevented me, and you stay away from saying that you didn't have an authority, people may buy it. The claim that there was undue intervention. And most of the interventions look about that way. Now, the sweeping cases that the court had taken in the past, most of them were 20, 15 years ago, but not nowadays.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that? So if the court isn't making usually such sweeping cases anymore, why is it still a sort of good target for political parties in an electoral campaign?
First, because it paid off in the past. The second one is that we do have peculiar circumstances right now. And this is the prime minister standing at trial on various charges of bribery and breach of trust. And when the prime minister himself is attacking the court, which he didn't do until the charges against him brought up a couple of years ago, then it gives credibility to other parties also to attack the courts. I do have to say that some of the politicians who are attacking the court do sincerely believe that a new system should be implemented. And they believe that the court is interfering in the decisions of the acting politicians. On the other hand, if it is not for the court to make a decision, there are no checks and limits in the Israeli system. Remember, Israel is having only one legislative power, the Knesset, and laws can be made there by a simple majority. Even amending the basic laws can be done by a majority in most of the basic law by simple majority. In several basic laws, by 61 out of 120 members. Now, if it is not for the court to intervene, then any majority can legislate whatever it wishes to do and carry it out.
Okay. So for many years, the judiciary, together with the army, was one of the most trusted institutions in the Israeli democracy. Is this still the case?
Yes and no. The Israeli Democracy Institute is carrying out every year public opinion polls about trust in democratic institutions. And usually the court was there, especially the Supreme Court, with approval rate of about 85, 80%. Because of the attacks on the court, that number has dropped in recent years to about 50. So while the army is still maintaining its rate of approval. On the other hand, other institutions like the Knesset and the government, they are at about 25%. So all of them went down, all branches of government. And the court is trusted more than other institutions, but they are all taking a sharp dive.
Okay, thank you. So this leads me to my next question, which is if the judiciary is still more trusted by the population than other political institutions, besides changing the, what are the proposals for among politicians who are critics of the High Court? How exactly do they want to see it changed in terms of institutional changes?
Maybe I will bring up one PowerPoint.
By all means, please.
To show you the what is the level of trust among different segments of the Israeli population, and then I would field the question because it will make more sense in that case. Now, this is, I would like to get down here. If you look here at trust in the Supreme Court by religiosity, then you can see the big difference. Among Haredim, ultra-Orthodox, it is only 6%. And when you move to national religious, you go up to 25. But if you look at the secular, it is 70%. So this is the real rift in Israeli society. Also, if we look at different parties, then we can see that the ultra-Orthodox parties, some of their voters are not Haredi, okay? So they don't have trust in the court at all. But if you go to Labor and Blue and White, which is now part of the coalition, then you're staying at about 80%. Now, the calls for reform are the following, okay? I will bring one more. No, not this one. Yeah, this one. First, it is to change the Israeli method of selection, how you select judges. Currently, the judges to Supreme Court and also to other courts, they are selected by a committee of 9, in which politicians are only 4 out of the 9. The 5 others are 3 Supreme Court justices and 2 lawyers elected by the bar, which means that the politicians, they can't have their way unless they cut a deal with other people in the commission. One of the proposals is to change the composition of the committee and have more politicians and less judges. So in that case, everything is open to political deals, like in the US. Another method, proposal, is to put a constitutional court, like in some European countries, above the Supreme Court. Now, I find this proposal a little bit strange, because if you like to have a constitutional court, you should have constitution in the first place. But Israel does not have a constitution. So how can you have a constitutional court without a constitution? By myself, if we have a constitution, I'm willing to buy the constitutional court idea. But what it means, if you look at European countries, the constitutional court is not a court, it's not a Supreme Court in the way that you in the United States and we in Israel understand the Supreme Court. It is composed by the legislature as an appeal on the decision of the legislature. And some of the people who sit in that constitutional court are not judges. They are elected or former elected officials. So it is quite another method. Another proposal is to tell the court there are simple matters in which you cannot interfere whatsoever. It is out of your jurisdiction. For example, reviewing petitions by Palestinians in the West Bank, petitions against settlements, and so far. So these are the proposals. So far, they did not gain momentum. But I would say that if the next coalition is composed by the Likud and the three religious parties that identify themselves as the right-wing bloc, then some of the proposals are likely to go forward.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Yes.
I wanted to ask how the constitutional court that's proposed would be different from the High Court of Justice, which is already in place. And here's questions regarding, overstepping of government power and those sorts of questions that it has answered with a sort of constitutional jurisprudence in the absence of a written constitution. So how would the constitutional court differ from that, and would it replace it? Would the High Court still exist?
It is going to be different in a way that it should be nominated by another body, not by the judicial selection appointment committee. Okay, and now there are proposals. They are not yet fully phrased, but I would assume that they would be nominated by politicians, by the Knesset. And in that case, the assumption is that you put another court above the court, and if you can, in a way, nominate the justices or control the nominations process, the justices are going to decide according to the wishes of those who nominated them, in a way that you may be more familiar in the US when the president has the authority to nominate Supreme Court justices.
Okay. So it potentially could harm judicial independence in Israel?
Yeah, and another method that is also brought up from the US is having a hearing for Supreme Court nominees in the Knesset. Now, looking at what's going on in the US Senate, they're not going to be asked what is their opinion about criminal offenses or about, let's say, civil or commercial matters. They're going to be asked, what is your opinion about the settlements? What is your opinion about religious courts? These are going to be the questions which are really political one. And in that case, you can have the screening by looking at their political views.
Thank you. So I had another question, which is, you've talked a little bit about how the justices are currently appointed or elected. Why are there attacks on the method of selection now?
Can you repeat the question?
Why are there attacks on the method of selection of the justices?
Again, they believe, I mean, the people who attack, they believe by a new method of selection, they can get different justices to the Supreme Court. I can tell an anecdote about this one. A couple of years ago, when the attacks intensified, I've decided to write an article for the Daily Haaretz. Now, in that time, there was a claim that all the justices are from European origin. They all live in Rehavia, which is an affluent neighborhood in Jerusalem. They all are graduates of the Hebrew University, and they all vote for the Meretz party, which is the extreme left. Of course, it was not true, but this was a claim. And the demand was that you make the nomination more representative. So I said, okay, I'm willing to tackle this one. I think that representative criteria is not a good criteria to begin with. Not that it should be totally ignored, but you don't start with that one. But in case you like to start with representative idea, let's start with the rabbinical courts. Over there, all the judges are males. They're all religious, and they all live according to almost all of them to Haredi lifestyle. So why don't we start with representatives from there, nominating a few secular ones, a few women, maybe a gay or two, and then if it works, we take it to the civil system. Now, of course, there were attacks, and but it is still there on the table.
So typically the majoritarian institutions in government are the executive and legislative, or in Israel's case, parliamentary Knesset branch.
Yes.
So the critics of the court are wanting to turn the judiciary also into a sort of representative branch rather than a professional.
In a way, I think that those voices are calmed down because in the last couple of years, due to the composition of the nomination, the Judicial Appointments Committee, and the pressure to nominate different judges, it became, in a way, more representative. And there are judges on the Supreme Court who are identified, for example, there are two settlers already on the Supreme Court. And other people who were pushed forward by right-wing politicians. So in a way, you can see much larger representation of judges who are identified with the right wing already on the court. And in that case, the demand to have representative quota is diminished, but the other demands to reform the court are still there.
Okay, so I think we addressed one of my questions, which was in addition to proposing to change the method of selection for Supreme Court justices, are there other proposals to change the judiciary? Are there any other proposals that we haven't talked about already?
I believe I talked about 4 different ones, or 5. One is to change the criteria for selecting the judges. The other one is to put a constitutional court on top of, we talked also about hearing and limiting the power of the Supreme Court.
Thank you so
that
much.
It should be refrained from certain matters.
And what sorts of matters are they suggesting that it be limited from here?
Not to review decisions of the military commander in the occupied territories on matters related to settlements, and also on the jurisdictions of rabbinical courts.
And, okay.
Now, I do have to say that currently the High Court of Justice did not interfere with interpretation of the Jewish halacha or the Jewish law. When it interferes with religious courts, usually it is when they're stepping out of their authority. And maybe should I bring up an example of that?
Absolutely, please.
Okay. A couple of years ago, Israeli traveled to Denmark, and he met there a Christian Danish girl. Because they wanted to get married, he asked that girl to go through conversion, which she did. And then they were married and immigrated, according to Jewish law, and immigrated to Israel. A couple of years later, he wanted to get a divorce. But instead of going to the court and asked for divorce in the regular manner, to have his wife agree to get a get, or the way that in Hebrew law you get the divorce, he told the rabbinical court that her conversion was not real one, that it was a fake. And the rabbinical court accepted the claim and said, since she is not a Jewish, there is no marriage. And therefore, he's free to marry whoever he wished to marry. But here was a problem. The rabbinical court has an authority to deal only with Jews. If it is a mixed marriage, it cannot make a decision. There is another court that deals with that. So the rabbinical court could have done two things: to treat the wife as a Jewish, and therefore she has to agree to agree to the divorce, or to say she is not a Jewish, and then it goes to another court. They couldn't do both, saying that she is not a Jewish, and therefore she's not married. And in that case, the High Court decided that their decision is not constitutional at all, and they had to start the process from the beginning. Now, if one of the proposals is accepted, such intervention would not be feasible.
Okay. The High Court's intervention would not be feasible.
Yes.
Okay, I see. Wow. Okay. Is this wave of attacks on the judiciary tied in any way to the trial of Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Oh yes, by all means. By all means. I mean, Netanyahu, on that case of the judiciary, he stayed away from it in his first time as prime minister in 96 to 99, and then in the first 6 years of his new term. He's a prime minister already in succession from 2009. He started to attack the court and to pay attention to the court only when charges against him brought in 2016. And now he's attacking the court now frequently. So it is tied in a way what he's trying to do, and he's claiming all the time, not only about the court, but he's also claiming a collusion by the Attorney General and by the former police inspector to fabricate the files against him, to fabricate the charges against him. And when the court is, I mean, before a few of his appearances in court, he sent threats to the court. The first time he appeared in court, he came with the Likud ministers, and in a court hall before the beginning of the trial, and he let out a vicious attack against the court. Now, when the trial was about to begin, he went on Israeli television and said that if the trial starts according to the original schedule before the elections, it would be a judicial intervention in the elections. And not surprisingly, the court set the date to start presenting the evidence to April 5, 2 weeks after the elections.
Okay. Interesting. Okay. I have one more question, and then we have a handful of questions from the webinar participants. So I will ask my last question, and then if you have any last comments that you want to make before we move to the questions of the audience, that would be great. My last question is, assuming those reforms are pushed forward by the newly elected Knesset, in what way are they going to affect the Israeli democracy?
I think it will be, depends what proposals are embraced at the end. But let's say if it is the extreme proposals, then we can have a tyranny of the majority. If you look at countries like Russia, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, these are the models that can tell you how things can go wrong. They do hold elections on time. The elections are clean, technically, but the opposition parties do not have a real chance to compete. They are presented, they are there. And so, I mean, we wouldn't have many of the checks and balances that should be in a real democracy. It can be a formal democracy, but not a meaningful one.
So there would no longer necessarily be a meaningful judicial check on the other branches?
That's possible. I wouldn't say it is going to happen, but it is a possibility.
Wow, okay. Did you have any final comments that you wanted to share with us before I move to the questions in the chat room?
No, your questions were fine and thorough, and I'm ready to field any question.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Hoffnung. So we have one question from the chat room, which relates to your final comments. So the question is, what would you identify as 2 or 3 major forces impacting administration of justice and rule of law in Israel, impact of religious sector, and then impact of Russian Aliyah in the 1990s, American legal developments, Poland, sort of relating it to some comparative cases. So there are a broad sort of set of questions there if you want to answer any.
I'm not sure that I remember all of them. I mean, it was quite an array of questions. But
do you want me to repeat them one by one?
Please repeat the beginning, and then I will start to answer them.
A few major forces impacting the administration of justice and rule of law in Israel.
Okay. The systems that we have now is that we do have several pillars of law and justice. The court is one of them, but there is also another proposal is also to limit the powers of the Attorney General in Israel. The Attorney General is a major position in Israel. It is the person who is the link between the executive and the judiciary. And he has also some judicial powers. He can intervene in ongoing trials and stop the trial for the public interest. He is also the person who is in charge of the general prosecution, but at the same time, he is the legal advisor of the government, which means that he can tell the government, if you take such a step that you like to take, I'm not going to defend you if a petition is submitted to the High Court of Justice. And also for the government, his decision, he representing the interpretation of the law. If he tells the government you cannot act in a certain way, this is it. Now, the proposals in that case are to divide the powers of the Attorney General. So there will be one advisor to the government and one head of the prosecution, and also not to make the Attorney General a supreme authority for government officers in a way that they can seek advice from their ministerial advisors. And of course, in that case, they would be in charge of nominating the advisors. So they would nominate the advisors that are likely to make interpretations in their favor. So, I mean, if you put it all together, it is to have a democracy ruled by the majority. This is it, as it is. Now, let's field another one.
Okay. The impact of the religious sector on the courts. We've talked about that a little bit, but we had a related question from another person. So the impact of religious sector on the courts is a question from one person. And then another question is confidence in the religious courts. Who has greater and lesser confidence in the religious courts per se?
The religious parties are having great influence for a couple of reasons. First, it is the growing numbers, the birth rate of the religious sector. Look at secular families, the number of people per family is about 2.5. If you look at the ultra-Orthodox, it's 7.5. So it is, if now they are 11%, it is expected that in 30 years, there will be 30%. And it goes up. It is not only that their number is significant, but they are crucial for the right-wing bloc. A couple of decades ago, there was swing vote. Now they are entrenched in the right-wing bloc, and without them, there will be no bloc. So it is a growing influence in Israeli politics altogether. Now, there was a question about the religious courts.
Yes.
We have to make here a differentiation between the rabbinical court and the other religious courts. Because in Israel, there are 14 religious communities recognized by the law, and each of them is having its own judicial authorities on matters of family law. So in that case, it is much more difficult to see the trust in the religious courts. What you can see, and I don't have the numbers for that, is trust in the rabbinical court. I suspect that it is not high because it is not trusted by the secular people and also not trusted very much by the religious sector. If you look at the Haredi, the Orthodox, they don't turn to rabbinical courts. They do have their own religious courts, which are not recognized by the state, but are recognized by the public.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you. Yes. What do you see as the impact of the Russian Aliyah from the 1990s on the courts today?
It is not on the courts that much as it had a real impact on politics. They are, at the same time, they are very secular, but they are very nationalistic. And if you look at the fact that right-wing parties are winning all of the elections since the turn of the century, And I regard also the 2006, which won by a party named Kadima, as a win for right-wing parties, because the leaders of that Kadima party came from the Likud. The Russian Aliyah proved to be the decisive factor, because most of them, the great majority, voted for right-wing parties. Not only the Likud, but also Israel Ba'aliyah, Israel Beitenu, and other parties came up. So without them, it would have been much more difficult for right-wing parties to win so many elections in success.
Okay, thank you so much. So what do you see as the impact of legal developments in other countries on the Israeli courts, such as the US or even or Poland or other places?
At the beginning of the state, the influence of the US was crucial. Not only the US, but even more so the British tradition. The Israeli system was built by the British during their years in Israel from 1918 to 1948. There was also German influence, because many of the early Supreme Court justices were educated in German-speaking countries. But now, most of the proposals that are pushed forward are taken some of them are taken from the US, but only the proposals that provide more power to majoritarian leaders. For example, nominating the judges by the prime minister instead of the president. Hearing in the Senate, okay? Not enacting constitution. This is not talked about. And also practices that are taken from Poland, from Turkey, all of them are copying one another. I mean, in the authoritarian leaders, like Erdogan, Putin, Orban in Hungary, Duda, they are copying the methods one from the other.
Thank you. So we have a few more questions if I think we have time for. So one question is, would you agree with those who say that there is a substantial minority of citizens in Israel who do not respect civil authorities, and that they create a sort of sub-state within the state that can be assumed not to follow civil court rulings?
Lately, we had a real trouble of accepting decision related to COVID-19, and especially in the ultra-Orthodox sector, in which the rabbis, their representatives are sitting in the government, did not obey the decisions, the lawful decisions taken by the government. And in my interpretations, it was also against the Jewish halacha, because if you allow people and you give them a permission to risk their life in public gathering instead of listening to the doctors, I would say it is against the Jewish tradition, but it had been carried out by the rabbis and openly. And because of the upcoming elections, it was not enforced by the police. So I can say for the long run, it is creating a real problem. We could have seen that in what's happening in the Ben Gurion airport. I'm not sure if you are aware of that, but the government has decided now not to allow Israelis to come back. Only a small trickle of about 200 a day. The reason for that is that people who were supposed to be taken to quarantine in hotels, there were riots, there were people who escaped out of the quarantine in the hotels, who did not obey and the decision was they better stay in the countries in which they are right now rather than coming back to Israel. Because we cannot enforce the quarantine on people. Now, I would say that much of that is coming when people are seeing the way that the police is treating the ultra-Orthodox. I mean, they give it people in Tel Aviv who are sitting in public square a ticket for drinking coffee in public. And at the same time, they are ignoring demonstrations and funerals by thousands in the Haredi sector. So for the long run, we can see the trouble.
Thank you. We have a question. Are Supreme Court judges appointed for life? If not, what is the term?
They are not appointed for life. In Israel, there is mandatory retirement age of 70. You reach the age of 70, you do have to step out. So it is not for life.
Thank you. So we have a sort of statement here and then request for your opinion. The statement is proposing permanent solutions to temporary problems is ill-advised. When labor was in power, the justices reflected this. When Likud is in power, conservatives make appointments. An apolitical appointment may not work in practice, although I think the appointment process right now is heavily leaning towards a sort of professional judicial process, by contrast to what you described as a more political appointment process that's being proposed. But then the statement continues, even civil servants will prefer people who share their views. Therefore, this will tend to perpetuate the political views of those first elected. What is your opinion on this?
It is more of a statement rather than a question. I would say that when we think about the nomination of judges, it should be impartial and professional qualifications should be taken into account in the first place. Now, because the Israeli Supreme Court is handling many more decisions than the American Supreme Court, just to give you the numbers, in Israel, the Supreme Court sitting both as Supreme Court and High Court of Justice, and I hope the audience is aware between the two capacities of the Supreme Court. If not, we can elaborate on this later. But in the two capacities, it is taking about 10,000 cases a year, with full decisions in about 2,500. And if you look at the decisions, and so most of the decisions are made by panels of three, you don't see much difference between what is called right-wing justices and left-wing justices. I mean, most of the decisions are professional. Now, when it comes also to when it matters, and I do have, not myself, but I'm familiar with empirical research on this. On two matters, it is important. Then you can see the decision. When it comes to settlements, and when it comes to the authorities of religious institutions. Most people don't care that much about either of them.
Okay, thank you. There is a question about the duration of cases. Some cases take more than 7 years. What does this mean for the judicial system, or sort of the efficacy of getting cases heard and decided?
I think that to answer this one, I will have to share again
Please.
my PowerPoint. and then it will be easier to explain. Now, if you look here, this is the way the Supreme Court works. It works in two capacities. If you look at the right-hand side, you can see the Supreme Court of Appeals. So cases start at magistrate court, then they go up to district court, then they can get to the Supreme Court of Appeals, which is the Supreme Court. Now, cases that take this road can easily take 7 years, like in the US also. You start at the lower instance until you get to the Supreme Court. It may take 7 years. It may take less, but it is doable. Now, speaking as a High Court of Justice, again, it is a Supreme Court, but it is an institution, the High Court of Justice, invented by the British mandatory authorities. And in that case, you can go directly to the High Court of Justice if you do have a claim against official authority using its powers. 25 years ago, I went to the High Court of Justice during the elections of 1996, and I got my hearing in 7 days. This can be very fast, but sometimes the court can decide that it doesn't want to tackle a case. For example, now they do have a petition against the constitutionality of the basic law, Israel as the home of the Jewish people. They don't like to make a decision. It is already there for 2.5 years. And I would assume that what they like to do is to have the politicians solve that problem. Because how can you decide that a law, which I think shouldn't be in place in the first place, is unconstitutional when it is part of your constitution? It is a basic law. So it is a real judicial problem. In that case, it can take years. They don't like to make a decision. Any decision they make on that matter is going to look bad, regardless of what is written there.
Okay, thank you. There's a question: who has the authority to, or rather, who is charged with the authority to enforce Supreme Court and High Court decisions?
It is a good question and a hard one. We do have a case in point. It is the executive, and in that case, the police and the prosecution. Now, look at a case that is pending now. There was a petition against the nomination of Prime Minister Netanyahu as Prime Minister after the elections, because of all the matters of conflict of interests. And the court decision was that to reject the petition and the conditions that Netanyahu signs what is called an agreement of conflict of interests in 14 days. And the Attorney General sent him a draft, and he had his lawyers coming up with rejections and amendments, and he sent another one. And then he had started to ignore the demands of the Attorney General altogether. And lately, he claimed 2 weeks ago that he's not going to do it. Now, he has a case, decision of the court that he had to sign such an agreement. So now the case is coming again before the court. What do you do? And the Attorney General is saying he didn't sign it. Okay, so, but the petition was in the first place that he cannot be a prime minister, and it is already been rejected. What is left there is only signing the agreement about the conflict of interests. That because he is standing trial, he cannot interfere in nominations of very sensitive positions in the public sector. No problem.
Thank you so much. I think we have two more questions. So what are the chances that the Israeli government will accept American certificates of complete vaccination and thus allow Israelis to come back home? And the question is in regard to some older Israelis who have been in the news.
I don't think I do have a capacity to answer that. Because, for example, I'm vaccinated right now, and I'm teaching at UCLA. I wanted to go there. Now, the reason I'm right now in Israel and not going abroad, and I do have an Israeli vaccination certificate, is that I'm not sure that when I come back, if I can avoid quarantine, and if I'm allowed at all to come back to Israel. So it is not only American certificate, it is only a problem for people who have an Israeli certificate.
So it's going to take time before we know if that policy is going to change.
Yes, yes. I suspect it will be eased out when the numbers are coming down. Maybe in a month or two. Because in Israel right now, we are becoming very close to what is called herd immunity. Mm-hmm. More than 50% of the population already got at least the first shot of vaccination, which means that in a month, we will have more than 50% of people who are fully vaccinated. And about another 10% are already people who got the COVID and are now healthy. So if you bring that number together, it is more than 60% of the population who are either vaccinated or already after having the disease. I guess that by April, we are going to reach about 80% or so.
So that may change the policy, we can hope.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Thank you. The last question is, since the appointment of some justices who are more positively oriented towards settlements, has the substance of the Supreme or High Court decisions changed?
You know, people who we have seen that before. Now, I do have to say that I'm seeing some of the questions appearing in the chat, but I'm unable to do them simultaneously. So you tell me what to answer and what not to answer.
Okay, I think we're answering more of them, most of them. I have some new ones that just came up.
Yeah. Now, we saw in the past, when it comes to settlements, judges who are themselves settlers find it very difficult to rule against the settlers. There were cases in which they did, but they are rare. It sure affects the outcome.
Okay, thank you. So I guess one last question is, how can someone become involved in the Israeli Bar Association if they are part of the American Bar Association?
If you don't have an Israeli license, it is more difficult. But I know that the Israeli bar is having an agreement and also exchange with American there is no Americans, so there is no one American bar association, but they do have ongoing exchange with American associations. So maybe if you look for an American association who is having ties with Israel, this is the way to engage in conversation.
Okay, thank you. I don't know if you want to answer one more question. Another one just came up, or how are you feeling? You must be tired by now. Well, I'll ask this question, and then I think we should adjourn. So somebody is asking the question: how are the rules of standing in Israel for the right to sue by comparison to the American legal system? And the question is not clear whether the person means the right to sue an individual in society or the right to sue the government, which I think are two different answers in Israel.
In the High Court of Justice, the matter of standing was eased significantly over the last 40 years or so. And the person who led that trend was former Chief Justice Ron Barak. And constitutional matters, almost any citizen can go to the High Court of Justice. Recently, there are calls, even within the Supreme Court, to go back to the old standing doctrine, in which you do have to show genuine interest why you should bring up that case. Now, when it comes to civil matters or in regular court, I mean, even in the United States, there are 50 different systems, so how can you compare it? Okay. I have no method of how to compare.
Right, in terms of suing an individual. Oh, okay. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Hoffnung. We are very grateful at the Center for Jewish Studies and the University of Florida, and I hope that we have answered most people's questions. It's wonderful to see you, and great to have you here, sort of, via Zoom.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for the audience. They sure know how to ask questions, and not easy questions. But I tried to do so to the best of my ability.
Thank you.
Yeah. You're welcome. Take care, and thank you all.